There is a question that almost every person asks at some point in their life. It is a quiet question, sometimes whispered in the dark, sometimes shouted in anger. The question is this: what is the point of trying when everything is working against me? Most people ask this question and then move on. They find a small answer, or they forget the question entirely. But there was one man who answered it in a way that changed the world forever. He did not answer it with words alone. He answered it with his entire life. And his life was not easy. In fact, his life was one of the hardest that any human being has ever lived. His name was Stephen Hawking. He was born on January 8, 1942, in Oxford, England. The world was at war at the time. Bombs were falling on cities across Europe. But in that hospital room, a small baby arrived quietly, with no idea what kind of life was waiting for him. And nobody in that room had any idea that this child would one day help the entire human race understand the universe better than ever before. Stephen grew up in a family that loved books and ideas. His father was a medical researcher. His mother was a woman who believed deeply in the power of education. Their house was full of books, so many books that visitors sometimes had trouble finding a place to sit. The family was not rich, but they were wealthy in knowledge, and that turned out to matter far more. As a boy, Stephen was not the kind of student that teachers write home about. His handwriting was terrible. His grades were average. He was disorganized and sometimes lazy about his schoolwork. But the people who knew him closely noticed something unusual about him. When he looked at a problem, even a very difficult one, something behind his eyes came alive. He did not just look at problems. He saw through them, all the way to the answer, as if the answer had been there the whole time, and he was simply the first one to notice it. At school, his friends called him Einstein. It was meant as a joke, but jokes sometimes carry more truth than the people making them realize. He went to Oxford University at 17 years old, which was younger than most students. He studied physics and found it almost too easy. He later said, a little embarrassed, that he spent only about 1 hour a day studying. The rest of the time he was rowing boats, telling jokes, and enjoying the social life of a young man who had no particular reason to believe that his future held anything other than bright possibilities. Then he went to Cambridge University to study for his higher degree. And that is where everything changed. It started with small things. He tripped on a walk one afternoon and could not understand why. His legs felt strange, not fully his own. He dropped things. His speech became slightly slurred. He told himself it was nothing. Young men do not like to believe that something is wrong with their bodies. So he ignored it, the way people ignore small warning signs, because the truth behind them is too frightening to face. But the truth does not go away simply because we refuse to look at it. His father took him to a doctor, then to more doctors. Tests were done, results came back, and one day, when Stephen Hawking was 21 years old, a doctor sat across from him and told him the news that no young person should ever have to hear. He had amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. People today call it ALS. It is a disease that attacks the nerves that control movement. Slowly, over time, it takes away the body's ability to walk, to use the hands, to speak, and eventually to breathe without help. There is no cure. There has never been a cure. And in 1963, the doctors looked at this 21-year-old boy and told him that he had, at most, 2 years to live. 2 years. Stephen left that hospital and went back to his room at Cambridge, and for a while, he fell apart. He stopped working. He stopped caring about his studies. He drank more than he should have. He asked himself the same question over and over again. Why work toward a future that would never arrive? Why build anything, learn anything, create anything, when the disease would take everything before he ever got to use it? This is the part of the story where most people might give up. And no one would have blamed him. No one in the world would have looked at a 21-year-old boy with a terminal illness and said, "You should have tried harder." The world would have understood if Stephen Hawking had simply stopped. But then something happened. Something small, the way the most important things in life usually are. He met a young woman at a party. Her name was Jane Wilde. She had dark hair and a warm, steady way of looking at the world that made the people around her feel calmer simply by being near her. She looked at Stephen, not at his illness, not at the wheelchair that was beginning to appear in his life, but at him. The man, the mind, the laugh. She fell in love with him, and he fell in love with her. And Stephen Hawking made a decision. If he was going to die in 2 years, he would not spend those 2 years feeling sorry for himself. He would work. He would think. He would push his mind as far as it would go, because the disease could take his body, but it could not reach the one place where he truly lived. His mind was his kingdom, and no disease in the world had the power to enter it. He returned to his studies with a kind of energy that surprised even his professors. He chose to study the most enormous questions in all of science. Not small questions, not easy questions. He wanted to understand black holes, those terrifying regions of space where gravity is so strong that not even light can escape. He wanted to understand the Big Bang, the moment when the universe itself was born. He wanted to know how time worked, whether it had a beginning, whether it could have an end. These were questions that the greatest scientists in history had struggled with. Stephen Hawking, a young man in a wheelchair who had been told he was dying, decided that he would answer them. And slowly, remarkably, he began to do exactly that. In 1965, he completed his doctoral thesis at Cambridge. In it, he proved something that shook the scientific world. Using the mathematics of Einstein's general theory of relativity, he showed that the universe must have begun in a single point, a point of infinite smallness and infinite energy, before exploding outward in what we call the Big Bang. He did not just suggest this. He proved it mathematically, with a certainty that left other scientists very little room to argue. He was 23 years old. The 2 years the doctors had given him came and went. He was still here. The disease was still progressing, slowly stealing movement from his body, year by year, like a tide that never fully goes out. But Stephen Hawking was still here, still thinking, still pushing. He married Jane in 1965. They built a life together in Cambridge. It was not a simple life. Jane helped him dress in the mornings. She helped him eat. She pushed his wheelchair and translated his increasingly difficult speech for visitors who could not understand him. They had 3 children together, Robert, Lucy, and Timothy, and their home was full of the beautiful noise that children bring, laughter and arguments, and the sound of small feet running on wooden floors. Stephen worked in the middle of all of it. He could no longer write by this point. His hands would not cooperate. So he did something that no textbook had ever told him to do. He moved his entire mathematical world inside his mind. He learned to visualize equations, to hold enormous and complex mathematical structures in his memory, rotating them, and testing them, and rebuilding them, without ever putting a single mark on paper. Years later, his colleagues would say that this was actually one of the secrets to his genius. Because he could not write things down, he was forced to find the most simple, most elegant version of every idea. He had no patience for the unnecessary. Every thought had to be refined, down to its purest form. And pure ideas, it turns out, are often the most powerful ones. In 1974, Stephen Hawking made the discovery that would place his name alongside the greatest scientists who ever lived. For many years, scientists had believed that black holes were completely black. The name itself tells you why. They were regions of space from which nothing could escape. Not matter, not light, nothing. They were thought to be permanent, eternal, the universe's perfect prison. Stephen proved that this was wrong. Using a brilliant combination of 2 scientific theories that had never been successfully joined before, quantum mechanics and general relativity, he showed that black holes actually release energy. Slowly, almost invisibly, they leak tiny particles out into space. Over enormous periods of time, they lose energy and eventually disappear entirely. They are not eternal. They are dying, slowly, just like everything else in the universe. This discovery became known as Hawking radiation. It was so unexpected, so creative, so far beyond what anyone else had imagined, that some scientists refused to believe it at first. Then they checked his mathematics. Then they checked again, and one by one, the most brilliant minds in physics accepted the truth. Stephen Hawking had found something that no one else had seen. He had done it from a wheelchair, using only the power of his mind. By the early 1980s, the ALS had taken almost everything from his body. He could barely move his hands. His speech was very difficult to understand, even for the people closest to him. Then, in 1985, he traveled to Switzerland for a science conference and became very seriously ill with a chest infection. The infection became so dangerous that doctors in Switzerland told Jane that they could turn off his life support. Jane said no. Stephen survived, but the surgery that saved his life took away the last of his natural voice. He could no longer speak at all. For most people, this would be the end. The body completely silent, the voice completely gone. The world locked away behind glass. But a computer programmer in California heard about Stephen's situation and sent him a piece of software. The program allowed Stephen to select words and letters by moving a small hand controller. The words were then read aloud by a computer voice, a slightly robotic, American accented voice that sounded nothing like Stephen Hawking the man. Stephen used this voice for the rest of his life. When better, more natural voices were developed later, he refused to switch. He said that the robotic voice had become his own. It was how the world knew him. It was who he was. With 15 words per minute, Stephen Hawking wrote books. In 1988, he published a book called A Brief History of Time. He wrote it not for scientists, but for ordinary people. People who had never studied physics. People who sat in offices and drove buses and cooked dinner and quietly wondered, in the back of their minds, how the universe began and whether time had always existed and what, if anything, was there before everything. His publisher told him that every equation he put in the book would reduce the number of readers. Stephen included one equation, Einstein's famous E equals mc squared, and then wrote the rest of the book in plain, simple, human language. The book became one of the most successful books ever published. It stayed on the bestseller list in Britain for 237 weeks in a row. It was translated into 40 languages. More than 10 million copies were sold around the world. A man who could only produce 15 words per minute had written a book that the entire planet wanted to read. People who could run marathons, people who could climb mountains, people with full use of every muscle in their bodies, sat down and read the words of a man who could not lift a finger, and those words changed the way they understood the world they lived in. There is a lesson in that, a very important one. Stephen Hawking was not a perfect person. It is important to say this, because the truth of a person's life is always more interesting than a polished statue of them. He was stubborn. He could be cold to the people closest to him, because his mind was always somewhere else, somewhere vast and dark and full of stars. His marriage to Jane eventually ended, after 25 years, under the pressure of his illness and the weight of everything they had carried together. It was a painful ending to a relationship that had literally saved his life. He was known at Cambridge for driving his wheelchair very fast through hallways and not always paying close attention to whose feet were in the way. He had a sense of humor that was sharp enough to cut, and he used it often. He was competitive and demanding, and not always easy to be around. But the people who loved him with great intensity, because beneath all of it was a man who looked at the universe with pure wonder, a man who woke up every morning inside a body that was actively working against him and still chose to ask the biggest questions he could find. A man who found freedom, not in movement, not in speech, not in any of the physical things that most of us take completely for granted, but in thought. He appeared in television shows. He recorded voice cameos for cartoons and comedy programs. He gave lectures to thousands of people at once, sitting very still at the front of enormous rooms while his synthesized voice filled the air above them. He visited schools and spoke to children. He made jokes about black holes and time travel and the nature of God with the same relaxed confidence that other men use to talk about football. He traveled to zero-gravity flights, weightless for a few minutes, laughing, floating free of the wheelchair for the first and only time in decades. He said it felt wonderful. He said that being weightless felt like being free. He died on March 14, 2018. He was 76 years old. The doctors who had told him he had 2 years to live in 1963 had been wrong by 55 years. He was buried in Westminster Abbey in London, one of the most respected resting places in the world, between the graves of Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin. 3 men, 3 different centuries. 3 minds that permanently changed what human beings understood about the world they lived in. After his death, his family arranged something beautiful. A message was broadcast from a radio telescope in Spain into space, directed toward the nearest black hole. The message was set to music, composed specially for the occasion, and the words broadcast into the universe were words spoken in Stephen Hawking's own synthesized voice, the robotic American accent that had become one of the most famous sounds in human history. He had spent his life studying the universe, and at the end, the universe received a message from him. There is something worth sitting with in this story. Something worth thinking about quietly after you put it down. Stephen Hawking did not succeed because he had an easy life. He did not achieve great things because the conditions were right. Because the world made space for him. Because everything went according to plan. He achieved what he achieved precisely because none of those things were true. He was handed one of the most difficult lives imaginable. He was given a body that betrayed him before he was even old enough to understand what he was losing. And inside that betrayal, he built something that the whole world still benefits from today. He answered the question that almost every person asks at some point in the dark. The question about the point of trying when everything is working against you. His answer was not a speech. It was not a motivational quote on a poster. His answer was a life. A 76-year life, spent inside a shrinking body, thinking thoughts that expanded outward until they were larger than the universe itself. The body is not the person. That is what Stephen Hawking proved, not in a laboratory, not in a scientific paper, but in the simple daily fact of his existence. Every morning that he woke up and chose to think, to work, to question, to create, he was proving it again. The mind is the person, and the mind, when it is truly alive, cannot be trapped. Not by illness, not by silence, not by a body that has forgotten how to move, not by anything. Stephen Hawking was not a man who controlled empires made of land or soldiers or money. He controlled something larger. He controlled ideas, and ideas, unlike empires, do not fall. They do not age. They do not surrender to time or disease, or the slow cruelty of a body giving way. His ideas are still out there right now, traveling with the light, moving through every physics classroom on Earth, sitting in books on shelves in cities he never visited, in languages he never spoke, in the minds of children who have not yet been born. That is the kind of empire that never ends. And it was built entirely inside a body that the world looked at and saw only weakness. The world was wrong,